Yehuda Kurtzer.
Did you guys make this order on purpose? Once upon a time, a Jew was a Jew, a non-Jew was a non-Jew, and though the boundary that separated them was invisible, everyone knew it was there. Jewish identity in the pre-modern age divided us between Jews and Goyim. One of the great hubrises of the Jewish imagination is that for a people who has always been a fraction of a percentage of the world population, from the Jewish perspective, there's only two types of people, us and them. And I use this term of Jew and Goy very specifically, even though to our modern instincts it sounds offensive and it sounds derogatory. But the reason that I imagine the separation between them is because this was a major feature of what it meant to think about Jewish identity in the pre-modern age, to imagine that there was an invisible but concrete boundary that separated between us and the them, and that you had to actually cross through that boundary in order to become a member of the Jewish people. And it's been specifically, those of you who may remember the great comedy routine of the 1960s, Lenny Bruce's Jewish and Goyish. The truth is, many of you may not know it, but one of the great comedy routine of Jewish and Goyish from the 1960s, which is unrecognizable today and offensive to many young Jews, imagined that not only there was a difference between Jewish and Goyish, but that difference manifested not just in crossing the boundary and becoming a Jew, but in little implicit or meaningless ways in which you could tell the difference between a Jew and a Goy. So famously, lime jello, Goyish, black cherry soda, Jewish. Hadassah, Jewish, B'nai B'rith, Goyish. The idea of the Jewish-Goyish routine, the notion was, obviously, to cross the boundary literally and become a Jew means you have to convert or do a whole bunch of things in order to become a member of the Jewish people, but that implicitly we understood that there was something that differentiated us between us and them. And how did this come about? The way this came about was because we were, in Jewish identity in the pre-modern age, was defined and created by external forces and circumstances that kept us as a people essentially separate from the people who lived near us. If you see, anti-Semitism and ghettoization wind up creating this boundary between Jews and non-Jews such that if you were actually a member of the Jewish people, you could do and live in all sorts of different ways, participate in all sorts of activities, whether they were religious, ethnic, national, cultural, or communal. And we didn't imagine that those were actually the same behaviors. We knew as a Jewish people that acting as a member of the Jewish people by participating in communal institutions or by doing a religious ritual, that those were separate activities. But that Jewishness held all of these fundamentally together, and that circle becomes the boundary between Jews and non-Jews. Once you actually enter into the story of the Jewish people, you may essentially be more of a religious Jew or a communal Jew or a national Jew, but Jewishness is actually tied together in ways that are beyond our control. Today, however, we're seeing a breakdown of these behaviors into totally discrete activities, none of which requires the other, and most importantly, each of which constitutes a separate, different entry point for non-Jews to participate in Jewish life. So for instance, religious. Non-Jews can participate in Jewish religious ritual all of the time. Perhaps the most famous visual image of this is the Passover Seder at the White House, in which not only are non-Jews not participating in Jewish religious ritual, but in many cases they are becoming the conveners. If Jews do Passover Seder more than any other ritual on the Jewish liturgical calendar, which is true, I would say it's equally true that more non-Jews participate in the Passover Seder than any other Jewish ritual activity. So it's possible already for non-Jews to participate and to enter into the Jewish people by participating solely in religious life without crossing the boundary and becoming a Jew. Or we might look at the national way in which non-Jews can participate and join the Jewish people without actually crossing the boundary and becoming a Jew. The photo up on the slide is of a Bedouin Israeli soldier, and this is an official IDF photo, in which he says, "I'm a part of this country, everyone serves in the IDF." Parenthetically, not true. And there is no reason that I wouldn't do the same. Perhaps more famously, and perhaps more sadly, this is the story of the Russian Aliyah of the past generation, which brought many people through the right of return that can qualify as a member of the Jewish people by being part of the national story of the Jewish people, but don't actually become officially part of the Jewish people because they're not religiously qualified to be members of the Jewish people. But this has become a national identity, has become an entry point to the Jewish people, in which nobody expects that this Bedouin soldier is actually, by crossing over, become formally a Jew, but this person is participating in Jewishness as a result. Or we might look at communal belonging. And here, JCCs are way ahead of the curve anyone else. I pulled this off of the JCC website as part of the preamble to this vision and statement of principles. The JCC movement comprises many communities of Jews and non-Jews spread across North America with very different approaches to Jewish living and learning. Not only is it not impossible for a non-Jew to cross the boundary into Jewish communal institutions, but as we just heard, in many Jewish communal institutions, JCCs ahead of most, and synagogues as well, non-Jews are not only members, but they have become part of the shaping of the identity of our community institutions. Cultural. We have now started in our community, this is the back of a bus in San Francisco. We now put our cultural activity, the stuff that once upon a time would have been the means of actually the community celebrating its own cultural activities, we now celebrate our cultural activities profoundly in the public square, and by doing so, we invite non-Jews to participate in Jewish culture. And finally, ethnic. Ethnic identity, that is, being born Jewish, is no longer a meaningful advantage or even a head start. This is the most famous, the money piece of the Pew study. The 22% of people who think of themselves as Jewish but describe themselves as no religion tells the story that if once upon a time being born Jewish meant that you had an easier entry point, or you assumed that all of the rest of this stuff, religious, communal, national, or otherwise, was part of the package to which you belonged, it's no longer obviously the case. Being born Jewish does not make you feel necessarily more proud of being Jewish, and it doesn't necessarily demand that you take on all of those other activities as well. And so instead, unlike where we started, where we looked at Jewish identity as being an essential difference between Jews and non-Jews, Jewish identity in a boundaryless age looks totally different. Jewish identity in the boundaryless age imagines that each of these different spheres are points of entry into Jewishness. Each of them can actually stay points of entry into Jewishness that don't require taking on the other behaviors. And if we can talk about some essential notion of Jewishness, perhaps it lies at the center of, or at the intersection of these points of entry, rather than being entirely encompassed in some implicit boundary or difference between Jews and non-Jews. Ultimately, what we are left with is not thinking about Jewishness as a boundary to be crossed, but actually as a spectrum of different activities that somebody might do to enter and cross into the story of the Jewish people. In each of these, I've made this slide here. In each of these, you can see the language of spectrum makes sense. You can enter into the story of the Jewish people through participating in religious activity. You can enter into the story of the Jewish people by participating in national activity, through communal activity, through cultural activity, and through ethnic activity. In each of them, there's an opportunity for us and our institutions to create more thickness and depth. Just because somebody has crossed the boundary and entered doesn't mean that everything that they're doing is thick and deep and rich. But we no longer have the luxury to claim that simply because a person enters in one way, that they necessarily have bought the whole package. The future of Jewish pluralism actually might lie in that once upon a time, Jewish pluralism meant that all of us are in the same religious camp, and we have to find ways in order to get along. The future of Jewish pluralism may lie in recognizing that the point of entry for non-Jews into Jewish life has become so diverse that we have to become much more radically pluralistic of the possibility of pluralism between those who have crossed from non-Jewishness to Jewishness on a religious spectrum, those who have crossed over from non-Jewishness to Jewishness on a political spectrum, a national spectrum, a communal spectrum, or an ethnic spectrum. The most possible rich idea that we could think about is not to try to demand that there are implicit or explicit boundaries between Jews and non-Jews anymore. That story is over. This is one of the gifts of being in America, is the possibility of being so present in a society that non-Jews actually want to be part of our people. We've got to figure out how to embrace it and not become obsessed with creating higher and higher boundaries. If we want to maintain some sensibility of the thickness and richness that's come with Judaism, let's imagine that all of these points of access with all of their different colors can be enriched and thickened in each of their different ways, and that the composite of Judaism can be as beautiful as a rainbow. Thank you.